Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is farewell and legacy. The year is 1796, and Washington's second term is finally coming to an end, and at this time, he passes out any entreaties to run for another term of office. He is ready to retire, and so he decides to give a message to his country in the form of a farewell address, a farewell report, if you will, that appeared in the American Daily Advertiser in September 19th of 1796. The words are really Alexander Hamilton, who did most of the writing and the wordsmithing, but the ideas are very much Washington. This is the message that he wanted to send based on his experience, his insights, and his message on things that the country, frankly, should really be concerned about and hopefully act upon. And so in using his words, let's talk about his farewell. He started off with an imperative of the Union. One nation. This is something that had been fixated in Washington's mind really ever since the Revolution, through the Constitution, through his presidency, the imperative of a strong single union. He writes in his farewell, "To the efficacy and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliance, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute." He's very concerned about growing sectionalism in the North versus the South and other parts of the country that he continues to think is going to be problematic for the Union. He talks about the Union as the main prop of your liberty. And he goes extensively into the farewell address to remind his countrymen how important it is to preserve that Union as a whole. One of the other things that he feels could be fracturing the country are factions. Political factions, political parties that he calls in his address baneful and rank. And he says about factions, there are potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. They ultimately exist for the purpose of their own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Washington knows all about political factions because they started in his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, different sides on almost every issue, and they really foment the rise of political parties, the two-party system that Washington decries, but even Washington acknowledges may be inevitable. He just advises against it. But as we have seen over the last 240 years, that's exactly what we've gotten, is a consistent changing of the landscape, but two strong political parties have been the nature of American political jurisprudence for really the entire length of the country, despite Washington's warning against it. Washington is also worried about separation of powers. Again, this is something he had a challenge with as most recently as the Jay Treaty, when he was the first president to claim executive privilege, telling the House of Representatives, and James Madison actually, no, I'm not going to send you those papers because you have no right to them. He's worried about this usurpation of power across the branches. And he writes, the spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. He's worried about the legislature encroaching on the executive, because the executive obviously was his frame of mind, but his message is respect the Constitution, respect the separation of powers to avoid tyranny. There's actually several references to the Constitution in Washington's final address. He says, just like he said when the Constitution was first passed, it is subject to amendment. The people can change, both the combination of the Congress and the states can change the Constitution at any time. But while it stands, it must be adhered to and enforced as is. Washington notes that for the Constitution, sacredly obligatory upon all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes the duty of every individual to obey the established government. Washington had no interest in people trying to change things on the fly and coming up as objectors to certain policies without going through the process outlined in the Constitution to actually change the rules. Until you change the rules, you follow the rules. That was Washington's point of view and his advocacy. Washington also opined on the characteristics needed for the American experiment to thrive. And this is quite interesting, where he says, "It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Virtue or morality." This is incredibly important to Washington because a free government relies on the ability of the people to pick someone who is going to operate in their best interest. To have a North Star, the best of the country in mind, virtue and morality as his guide. This is how George Washington lived his life. He was the archetype for it. Many of his successors struggled in this regard to varying degrees, but for Washington, it was a critical success factor for, again, the American republic and democratic principles to survive. Washington also advocates the diffusion of knowledge for an educated electorate in his farewell address is absolutely critical to the success of this kind of government. He advises to cherish the public credit. Use it, but use it wisely. And then he comes to an end where he talks about foreign affairs, and he gives his famous guidance to avoid entangling alliances. His specific words were, "Nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded. And then in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The great rule of conduct for us in this regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible for foes and allies." Washington was about neutrality. In his neutrality proclamation, which he issued regarding France in the 1790s, that mindset stayed with the country for basically 100 years. When William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt came along in the late 1890s, war with Spain, the idea of neutrality actually took a back seat and really has never come back. But for the first 100 years, Washington felt there was no upside to getting involved politically with foreign countries, either foes or allies, because the United States needed to settle its own affairs, get on a solid footing, and these political entanglements, in his view, could only add to a negative outcome for the United States. Now, there is one topic on which George Washington was completely silent in his farewell address, and that is slavery. Consistent with his political career at the Constitutional Convention as President of the United States, he simply did not touch that topic. He left it for the country to figure out. He had no public advocacy on the topic of slavery. But these were the things on Washington's mind. Again, Hamilton wrote the words. They're Washington's views, though, that drove his commentary to his citizenry, his fellow Americans, as he left public office finally in 1796 to leave office in 1797. Washington's legacy is frankly overwhelming. And part of the challenge is to think about the difference between the man and the myth. Washington was a man, and he had foibles. He was thin-skinned, he was ambitious, he had bad temper, he was a slaveholder. There were things that were in Washington's character that were problematic. He was not a perfect person. But the myth side has some merit, because Washington was, in fact, the archetypal leader for a democratic republic. He turned his life and molded his life into pretty much everything you would want to have for that first leader, or any leader, in this world where the people are electing and you're going to trust somebody to do the right thing. Washington had that mindset really throughout his entire public career, certainly starting from when he took over at the Revolutionary War. And think about Washington's accomplishments. This ragtag band of farmers defeats the British after 8 years of war. The British have the most powerful army in the world, and it's Washington's leadership, his strategy, his holding the men together, that was the indispensable part of that victory. The Constitution, though Articles of Confederation weren't working, the government needed something to formulate a stronger union. The Constitutional Convention was the answer, and it would not have been successful, most likely, if Washington hadn't agreed to go. His presence made that big a difference. He was the indispensable man, even though he was relatively quiet, because without him, there probably would have been no convention. And then, of course, as president. Nobody knew how to be a president of the United States in this new democratic republic, this new experiment. No other country in the world had done something like this. Washington was the man who was trusted to do it. He was the only man that was really trusted, and he put down precedents and principles that have survived, frankly, for the entire history of the Republic. He was the indispensable man at every one of these stages. So the question is his legacy. There were many founding fathers, and certainly Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and others had very prominent roles in the founding of the country. There were many founding fathers, but there was only one father. There is only one father to the country, and that is George Washington. But Washington's legacy is greater. Because if you think about what has happened in world history, when the United States became this democratic-based republic in 1800, it was the only one of its kind. And really, the United States was even a bit on edge through the Civil War until it really solidified itself as this single entity. And it was at that time that the rest of the world started to follow. As you can see in this chart, from Our World in Data by Max Roser, the downsizing of colonization and authoritarianism and the rise of democracy, especially over the last 100 to 150 years, this could not have happened without somebody setting the stage. And the United States was that country that figured out how to have a democratic republic and have it be effective and successful, and to set the light for the rest of the world, to give at least a model to follow. It's done differently all over the world, but the model had to be established first somewhere, and that was the United States. And if George Washington was the father of that effort, the father of his country, the indispensable man, one has to ask the question, who else has had more of a positive impact on the world than George Washington over the last 200 years, or maybe the last 2,000 years? That's where we look at the overall context of the impact that this man, George Washington, had on his country and the world. That is George Washington, Farewell and Legacy, from the life of George Washington. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.